On Sunday nights, for the handful of you that have not been with us on Sunday nights, we have been looking at the life of David. In fact, I've been using as a heavy resource the Power Lectureships from South Haven a few years ago, that the entire lectureship was on the life of David. And so we're going to turn, in the last couple weeks, we'd been looking at David the singer and David the seer. And tonight we're going to turn into a new chapter or phase of his life and consider David the shepherd, a compassionate heart. And the outline that we have, you see we're making progress. We're almost down through there. The outline we have here is looking at different aspects of David's life. But when you think about David, there's a lot of things that can come to mind. And certainly all these traits and all these roles and all of these characteristics are part of David. And I imagine if you would just randomly tonight, before I gave you time to think about it, or if you would go out in the street and you'd say, hey, what do you know about David, about King David? Someone undoubtedly would say, oh, he was a young boy, a young man, and he slew a giant. Undoubtedly, someone would say that. Surely someone would bring to our attention that he was a great king, possibly the greatest king in Israel, and a man after God's own heart. Someone certainly would bring that up. Some are probably a little more fond or a little more likely to remember the negative, and they'd say, well, he had that whole scenario with Bathsheba, and might think about all the problems that led to in his family life and in the kingdom. Others might talk about David as a father, both the positive and the negatives. But I don't think any of these compares to the impact, any single part of this compares to the impact that the sheepfold, that being out in the pasture, led to shaping David into the man that he was. I believe of all these phases that we see in his life, or elements of his life, that it is in the pasture that God shapes him most into a leader. And a keynote part of that is compassion. Compassion. When we think of leaders, we think of all kind of different things. But I'm mindful of this great quote from this amazing man. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? What are you doing for others? Maybe there's not a question that's more suppressed in the human's mind than this question. But for the Christian, this question is first and foremost. This question plays out in the life of Jesus Christ himself. We can talk about all the amazing things that God has done for mankind, but none of them come anywhere close to telling us who God is than his son becoming a man and living a life to the point of a horrific death, all for you and for me. At the heart of this question, what are you doing for others, is the issue of compassion. One of the things that jumps out at me when I read through Jesus' life is there's so oftentimes miracles that we can see why they took place. and we can understand why Jesus is doing them and how they fulfill his mission. But then there are so many times that we read, and he had compassion. He loved the young ruler. In fact, some of these times he says, go and tell no one. His motivating force was compassion. It's not hard to turn on the TV today and to see the state that our world is in. And we can turn to all kinds of different sources and avenues of fixing those things. And when I look at politics today and I look at less and less day by day, I can't anymore because I barely watch any of it. But when we ask the question, what's wrong with politics today? So many of the answers are about an elephant or about a donkey. It's about the previous president or the present president. But what the true issue, I believe, with politics today and the state of our nation is compassion. Compassion. You see, politics almost always have some form of pseudo-compassion built into them. You vote for me, and I'll care for you. You take care of me, and I'll take care of you. You donate enough to my party, and you will benefit. But what happens inevitably is people at the top, they're power hungry, that become incredibly wealthy individuals, oftentimes on the back of the very people whom they are promising to take care of. You see, the question to what are you doing for others is what Christianity comes down to with how are we different? How are we different in our lives? We were talking to Andy today, and he and Bridget both are administrators. And I was asking him for some advice because Mom was there and heard part of the conversation. We had more struggles this year with day camp in a behavioral sense than we've ever had before. And it was a challenge. And I told Andy, I said, I really struggled with, the answer is obvious. What would Jesus do? But the problem, Dwayne, is figuring out whether Jesus would sit down at the well with me, or with this young lad, or start flipping tables over. I was trying to figure out which side of the equation that he would have been on so I could know where I needed to be. And Andy made an interesting point. He said, listen, you may have to expel kids because they will ruin it for everyone. And he said something really interesting to me. He said, but let me tell you something that I always do if I'm forced to expel kids. I have to on a regular basis. He said, I follow up with them. He's talking about public school. From a position of superintendent and principal, he says, I follow up with them. I see how they're doing. I encourage them, and I try to help influence them in the right direction going forward. Teacher sitting at the table said, boy, that doesn't happen in my school district. And he says, that's what makes us different. He's not talking about his school district. He's talking about his Christianity. You see, I think sometimes we can look at David in the flock at the pasture, and and we bring it up often, he's learning skills that are going to serve him later in life. Well, what kind of skills are those? Well, he's learned how to kill lions. He's learned how to kill bears. He's learning how to use a staff. He's learning how to be authoritative. He's learning how to use, most importantly and above all else, a sling, right? And notice where we go with this. It's as though David is evolving. He's gaining skills so that he can seize power and then roll over. Kind of sounds familiar. You see, to the contrary, though, David was different. David, in the fields, was gaining a skill so much more important than a slingshot. David was learning a skill that was more important than how to kill a lion or bear. You see, those were moments that took place that were essential for David. He needed and used those skills. But Carl, how often do you think he was killing bears? I wouldn't think daily, would you? I mean, I hope not. Probably too often from his standpoint when those bears or lions are coming into the flock. But you know what he's doing every day? Is he's learning the needs of his flock. He's learning how to care when it comes at the expense of his own comfort. I'll never forget this. Dad, I wouldn't anticipate would remember this because I just threw too much of this kind of stuff at him on a regular basis. But I remember one time coming in from a horse ride, getting off my horse, unsaddling my horse, and there was a bunch of other horses there, and it was dinner time, and I went in to eat. And Dad just happened to go by the stable. And he was not proud because the horses' buckets were bone dry and there wasn't a bit of feed in front of them. Why didn't you take care of the horses? I was hungry. I'm going to get them after I eat. Wrong answer. Wrong answer. You see, David was understanding that his flock comes first. David was learning what true compassion was. And it's that trait over all the other warlike traits that I believe shapes him into the great leader that he was. In the sheepfolds, preparation for a greater service. David spent all this time in the fields doing what? He's learning. And notice when Saul dies and God takes the kingdom from him, is addressed there in verses 13 and 14 of 1 Chronicles, the 10th chapter, that then the prophets tell of what David does when he comes into his kingdom. And notice the skills that are addressed that are going to define his kingship. Then verse 11, or chapter 11, verse 1. Then all of Israel, by the way, Steve, you see what happens when you treat the AV people right? You get these up here. So it just takes a little more coddling than you were aware of. But notice this. Then all of Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led us out and brought us in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, you shall be my shepherd of the people of Israel, and you shall be prince over my people of Israel." You shall be the shepherd of my people. You know, Kevin read for us from John the 15th chapter and verses 15 through 17 there, I believe. And there's something that really jumps out at me about that. Because Jesus almost always used illustrations and analogies that were relevant to the people he was talking to. He goes to the fishermen, he says, I'm going to make you fishermen of men, right? He didn't go to him and say to the fishermen, I'm going to make you great gardeners of men. Now, he had lots of gardening or farming analogies he used, but he used those in locations to people who very well understood. Now, Peter's out fishing all night in this chapter. And we have this situation where they pull in at the prodding of Jesus, this whole net that is just full of fish. Peter understands who it is. He strips his cloak off. He leaves everyone else in the boat to do the work. He swims to shore, and then he sits down and he has breakfast with Jesus. Sounds like a good morning, doesn't it, Tom? But Jesus understands. Peter's suffering. Peter needs reassured. He says to Peter, do you love me? Do you think it's any coincidence that the last time, not quite the last time, but pretty close to the last time Peter saw Jesus, he was denying knowing him? 3 times. Peter, do you love me? But here's what jumps out at me in part. He doesn't use a fishing illustration. He's used those. He's used them with Peter. Peter's a fisherman, and he tells him, I'm not going to make you a fisherman of men. I'm going to make you a shepherd. Why? Because the demands on Peter are going to be brand new. What Peter needs to do is not just catch fish. He needs to care, nurture, and grow. Peter says, Lord, you know I love you. He says, feed my sheep. You think Peter was familiar with this passage? He says, do you love me, Peter? Lord, you know I love you. ESV says, tend my sheep the second time. Take care of my sheep. And lastly, once again, he says, feed my sheep. You see, David was learning skills that he needed. These skills were applicable to a king. They are applicable to elders. They are applicable to Christians. They are applicable to you and to I. Notice what David said. He understands what this whole shepherding is. And it's important for us to understand this because this is our objective. This is what we're doing as leaders in the church. This is what we're doing with the church as Christians. This is what we're to be doing with the world. He said, Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. How did David know that? Because he had learned how to provide the needs for those sheep. He had learned, you ready for this? How to know the needs of those sheep. You ever have someone try to do something really nice for you and they just completely missed the boat? Ever have anyone take you out for a really nice dinner to somewhere where you just can't stomach to eat? We went one time to eat at individual's house. They're just dear members of the church. And Christian, I don't know how he came about this in our family, but he eats almost no meat whatsoever. He eats some chicken. I'm not sure that qualifies is meat. And I'd always tell them, Christian, you eat what's on your plate. I don't want to hear any whining. I don't want to hear any complaining. You will be polite. You don't have to put anything extra on there. You don't have to get seconds. But if someone puts something on there, you eat it. I hold myself to that. But thankfully, I don't come across very many bad cooks. Now, we're at this place to eat. She cooked just a wonderful roast. Oh, it was delicious. Pot and says, oh my, you're a growing boy, you need more of that. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, he knew. But he waited till we got in the car to cry. Do you know what people want? What sheep wants? You know, sheep don't have these random desires that shepherds fulfill. They fulfill ideas that are essential for those sheep. They're described here. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Am I dead? Thank you. I'll stay right here instead, try and replace that. How's that? I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Here's the kind of shepherd we serve. Here's the kind of shepherd that David learned to be. And I will dwell, not in the pasture, in the house of the Lord forever. David understood what it meant to be a shepherd. I don't think there's a line in that passage that's not dripping with compassion. Compassion is an essential part of true leadership. John, the 10th chapter's amazing chapter and amazing statements by Jesus made here. And one of the things he does is he draws that contrast between himself and the kind of shepherds that preceded him. Number one, they were hirelings. They weren't going to risk their life for the flock. Number two, many that had come in had done so for their own good, were thieves and robbers. Jesus says that's not the kind of shepherd that I am. I'm the good shepherd, the true shepherd. Ezekiel 34th chapter, if we had more time, and I encourage you to jot it down and to look at yourself, gives this amazing description of the kind of shepherds that I believe Jesus is talking about in John 10. The kind of shepherds that Israel had that feasted on the flock. That instead of caring for it, was using it for their own benefit. Did you know religion can get that way? That's exactly what Jesus was talking about. He's drawn the parallel here to the Pharisees. Shepherds, whether it's elders, whether it's the leadership of the church, whether we're talking about the church in general, must be full of compassion. Must be for not merely the temporary or temporal good of the people, but for the eternal. Here's the question. Compassion. Now I've got to tell you, I had some help on this slide because I said compassion to who? Amanda left a great big Post-it note on my computer and had it sitting there, Corey, when I got home to correct me. Mike, I told Mike that, and Mike said, they're not going to believe that lesson was from you. Compassion to who? Isn't that the question that all the people were asking Jesus? You know, all these demands, Lord, to whom do I have to be nice? Who do I have to do this for? Man, I'll tell you what, Jesus was not an individual that you wanted to ask questions to. He never gave the easy answers. Isn't it funny that we struggle with the same questions today? Who do I have to be nice to? To those who are like me, those who agree with me, those in the church, those who don't persecute the church. Steve was talking on a very different topic, but hitting right down the line here from Acts, the 7th chapter this morning. As Stephen's being stoned, he makes an incredible statement of compassion towards the people that are getting ready to stone him. Why? One of the things that I think he pointed out so well is he understood that that's what he should do, not what he wanted to do. That's the example that was set before him. There in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about loving. And loving people's easy for the most part, isn't it? It's just when we get to who we love, the things get to be difficult. And when we love them. Because here's a news flash. Amanda loves me. Sometimes it's just harder than others. And it gets really, really hard. Really hard at times. There's a survey done, and Carrie Newhoff and Tom Rayner do a lot of work in this area. But there was a survey done of how friendly or how kind churches are. And it probably wouldn't shock you to know that high 90s, we're going to say 99% of churches, believe they're friendly churches. Here's where things get difficult. Did you know that visitors surveyed claim less than 50% of churches to be friendly? That's a big gap. That's a big gap. That's like me saying Amanda loves me 100% of the time, and she says, it's more like 42. There's a lot of times where I'm mistaking in there, right? Here's where it comes down to. Who are we friendly to? You see, the 99, probably 100, are correct. It's easy to be compassionate to those who are compassionate to us. It's easy to go and talk to someone whom we know loves us. It's a little more difficult, and more so for some than others. Most of us, a lot of us here are Smiths, so we seem to have a hard time not talking to people. But I know where even those of us that jump out and talk to the complete strangers struggle with. The individual just cut us off. The individual just cut in line. The individual just ran over my foot. The individual who was intentionally nasty towards me. Jesus says, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the politicians do, wait a minute. Do not even the tax collectors do the same? Wow. Luke, the 19th chapter, it's not without notice that Jesus is going into the house with Zacchaeus, and we teach kids about this story so much that we tend to kind of sanitize it and clean it up. And we can easily miss the point that Zacchaeus was hated. He was an outcast. What he had was money, a lot of it, and it's about all he seemed to have. You talk about a man with that much money, he had to climb a tree to even see the going on. No one would make room to let him see what's going on. And that's the context in which Jesus said, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So I think this is a question that we will forever battle with. I believe that we should continually be contending with. Are we the compassionate church? Am I a compassionate Christian? Comes down to leadership in the church, in our lives, in everything we do. I want you to think back. I already put it up there twice. I can't bear to put that picture in front of you one more time, but think about those two individuals in the middle of that debate just for one more second. And I want to ask, if we don't show compassion, who will? Who will? Paul talked about becoming weak to those who are weak, strong to those who are strong in the verses that follow verse 19 here. A Jew to the Jew, a Gentile to the Gentile, as one under the law to those under the law, as one without the law to those without the law. You know, sometimes we can miss the very most difficult thing about compassion. It starts by listening. You gave me a sheep, let alone a whole flock, I would have trouble knowing what to give them. I know they have hay and some water, and I could probably handle that. But if it got any more complicated, I'm out. But you let my life depend on taking good care of those sheep, and I'm going to be learning about sheep. I've got to learn about people. Not just people. I've got to learn about the people who need the love, grace, and salvation of Jesus Christ. We need to be the leaders. We need to show compassion. We need to have some David in us. There's a better example, though, isn't there? Because David fell short of this. And that's Jesus Christ. This evening, if we can help you become closer to him, if we can help you to know him better, or we can help you in your next step of your spiritual walk, here's the most urgent plea that I would make to you. Don't put it off. Don't wait. We have a compassionate Savior who's made himself available, who's gave everything of himself for you and I. If we can help you in your efforts to know him tonight, please make it known as together we stand and sing.